now. Okay, I think we'll just have to deal with the tech as it goes. Yeah, so anyway, so I'm Chris Manias. I'm a historian of science based at King's College London in the UK, and I work on the history of various subjects which have to do with time and change and development and human interaction with the natural world. So I've now, overseen or written sort of three books. The first book that I wrote came off my PhD work, and this was thinking about ideas of prehistory and kind of national origins in Britain, France, and Germany in the 19th century. So thinking about the history of fields like anthropology and archaeology and how they change over this period, and also how they get connected with things like ideas of race and nationality and this sort of thing. So that's my kind of earlier work. But after I did my PhD and kind of did more sort of historical research, then I became more and more and more interested in the history of paleontology in particular, because I thought it was a really, really interesting field for thinking about, how knowledge changes, how people understand time, humans, the relationship with the natural world, and really how the world itself and the various living things on the Earth are given a history and given a sort of sense of development and change over time. So I've written, quite a lot on the history of paleontology. The biggest thing that I've written is the book that you can see in the middle of the slide, which is called The Age of Mammals. And this is a book which is, trying to write a different sort of history of paleontology to the one that you might normally come across, which would really tend to centre the history of dinosaur paleontology or reptile paleontology in general as the main area where important things are happening, and really thinking about what would the history of paleontology look like if we adopted a different focus. And the focus that I chose to look at was the history of mammal paleontology, so things like, giant sloths, as you can see on the front, mammoths, mastodons, ancestors of horses, cave bears and things like that. And the book kind of makes an argument that if we look at the history of paleontology in the 19th century, then actually fossil mammals are often where public discussion is at and where most scientific interest is. And that's for a variety of reasons, which I sort of go through in the book. The book that we're sort of going through today is this edited collection, Paleontology in Public. I actually finally got the physical copies yesterday. They came through the post from UCL Press. Yeah.
Yeah, I had to tell you, like, from Joshua, you need to bring them to DinoCon. He wants to have it.
Right. Yeah. So I'll try to disseminate them. No, yeah, because they're full color, very, very, very nice. But this book has a bit of a backstory in that I'm a historian of science. So my training is in history, and the sort of field that I work in, history of science, it looks at changing, scientific developments over time, but often from quite an outside perspective. So one of the things that often surprises people about the history of science as an academic field is it's often doesn't interact with the modern scientists, but with the modern sciences in a very direct sort of manner. But when I was starting to become a historian of paleontology and starting to look in this area, then I found that many paleontologists, and particularly paleontologists who are interested in things like, paleoart, reconstructions, and so on, were engaging with the history of the field in a really kind of interesting, sophisticated way, and were dealing with quite similar questions to the ones that historians of science might ask about the field, like how does paleontology fit in with wider culture? How do, cultural stereotypes, cultural expectations affect the development of the field and the sort of studies and sort of reconstructions that it comes up with, and also, how has the fact that paleontology is such a publicly prominent discipline, how has that conditioned the field and its development? So I started kind of identifying all this about, around 10 years ago now, and I thought it would be very, very good to get, historians of science and other kind of humanities type academics interested in the history and culture around these fields into dialogue with paleontologists and museum people working in these areas. So luckily I got some money from my university. Let's try to change the slide. Luckily I got some money from my university to put on a workshop which was really bringing together um, a whole variety of different, historians, English literature academics, artists, and paleontologists who were interested in this kind of question of why has paleontology been such a publicly prominent field. And yeah, it turned out we had lots of interesting things to talk about, lots of interesting discussions. And so this kind of group, which eventually developed the sort of name of popularizing paleontology, current and historical perspectives, sort of carried on, and it's still kind of ongoing over the last 10 years or so. So we got a sort of grant to put together a whole load of workshops between about 2017 and 2019, which we did partly in London, partly at my university, King's College London. But we also had one workshop in the Netherlands and one workshop in the US. And then once kind of COVID hit and everything went online, then we sort of started up the sort of network as a kind of quite regular online discussion group. And this started, the kind of online session started maybe, I think, early 2021, and they're still kind of ongoing. So we're still sort of carrying on our discussions on quite a regular basis and have quite a good, kind of group going on talking about these issues. And we've got sort of some plans on how this can develop into the future. So we've been having these kind of quite regular discussions, and these have developed over the latter part of the development of this group into this volume, which came out earlier this year, but kind of which is a sort of multi-edited, sort of authored volume, and these things take quite a long time together. So I think we've been working on this volume. It's been about 5, 6 years in the making in terms of putting everything together. But it's being published by UCL Press, so it's freely available as an open access PDF, so freely downloadable for anyone, and people who want to get their own kind of physical copy can now order physical copies, which is good, and it's a nice full colour volume. And the book is really the kind of covering the sort of central question that the network as a whole is asking, which is drawing off the question of, why is paleontology and related fields such a publicly prominent discipline? Because on the one hand, this is fairly obvious to us that, dinosaurs, mammoths, human ancestors, and various other paleontological topics are just part of, kind of general sort of mental furniture across wide swathes of the population, wide swathes of culture. But on the other hand, this is potentially quite strange, because paleontology, prehistory, and so on, these are very technical fields. There is to a degree a fair barrier to entry to actually sort of engage with these subjects. And also, if you kind of look at the hierarchy of academic disciplines and sciences and so on, then paleontology and these sorts of fields don't get much in the way of resources and don't get much in the way of jobs or academic prestige compared to things like physics or the health sciences and so on. And so why these subjects, which are relatively operate on a relatively low scale within scientific institutions, should really punch above their weight massively in terms of public culture, is really a kind of question, really a problem that we need to kind of engage with. Another sort of set of approaches that we're really quite keen on following in this book is not regarding the public role of paleontology and its public prominence as just being a kind of good or beneficial thing. So it's not kind of following the agenda of, yay, everyone loves dinosaurs, isn't that great? Which, obviously we do have sympathy with that kind of approach, but that's not just what we're kind of looking at. What we're also kind of interested in looking at is the negatives of that process. So what price has the field needed to pay, on the one hand? So potentially with this public role leading paleontology being regarded as something either non-serious or for children, or only beneficial as like a gateway into proper sciences and so on. So that kind of thing. But also thinking about the potential dark sides that paleontology has been deployed for and paleontology has been used for. So thinking about its links with, colonialism on the one hand, which is something which is really prominent throughout the history of the field and a lot of research into it, and also, things like race and eugenics, which it has been quite closely entangled with at various different points. So that's what we're kind of interested in doing. Now, you may not be able to see this on the slide, but this is a kind of, roadmap of the different chapters in the book. So we've got, a whole range of different topics, which we ended up dividing the book into two large sections, one looking at kind of extinct reptiles, and the other one looking mainly at mammals and hominins. So we did this largely from pragmatic point of view. So when I kind of got the contributors together, then it turned out that most of them were interested in doing something quite taxonomic, so writing about particular types of organism or particular individual, case studies of fossil organisms. And they did tend to gravitate towards dinosaur and mammal paleontology. And one kind of choice I had to make quite early on in the development of the book is whether we would try to kind of expand things. So we would have more kind of case studies on invertebrates, birds, amphibians, and so on, or whether we would kind of lean into what was available from the kind of initial selection. And in the end, it was a very, very difficult choice, because I think there should be much more study of, invertebrate paleontology and bird paleontology and so on. But in the end, we thought that it would be good because so much of public discussion of paleontology has focused on dinosaurs and mammals to make this a kind of feature of what we're doing rather than regard that as a problem. But if I do a follow-up to this, then there will be a lot of invertebrates in there, because I think that there is kind of a lot of kind of important things.
They have to, like, there's so many, it's a huge mass of invertebrates, like, still today, and they played an important role, like, back then as well, so it's...
Yeah, and obviously, the overwhelming majority of museum specimens are invertebrates.
It's true, but unfortunately not. Like, I was in some museum recently, and they are very good in displaying dinosaurs, doing like the 3D models and stuff. And when it comes to invertebrates, they have like ammonites and trilobites, and then that's it basically most of the time.
Yeah. You might get a quite brightly coloured reconstruction of the Ediacaran or of the Cambrian in a little diorama, but you'll see those. But again, these tend to be constructed in terms of weirdness and strangeness rather than trying to get any sort of deeper understanding. So but anyway, we can talk about this in a kind of discussion. But so that's kind of what we're sort of looking at in terms of the chapters. There's 12 altogether, and I wanted to get a mixture of a variety of different sort of case studies. So we have some chapters which are focusing on very, very iconic, very prominent things that anyone with a passing familiarity with paleontological media would know about already, but looking at them in a new way. So things like, reconstructions of Spinosaurus, of prominent human ancestors like Neanderthals, of what you could term like paleomedia celebrities like Gertie the dinosaur from the 1910s. So we've got several chapters on this side of things. But we also wanted to look at some lesser studied topics and bring these in. So we've got one chapter, which I'll go into a bit later, on the Naosaurus, so a chimeric taxon which isn't recognised today, but which is the subject of a whole lot of interesting discussion in the 1910s. And there's a chapter co-written between me and Elsa Pancheroli on Mesozoic mammals and how these have been represented in popular culture across a long duration. And we also didn't just want the book to be about, classic regions in Europe and North America, but we wanted to cover different parts of the world. So there's a very good chapter on the place of fossil mammals in 20th century Argentina, and there's another very cool chapter on dinosaur paleontology in contemporary China. So aiming to cover quite a broad range of areas within the field of reptile and mammal paleontology, both geographically and thematically. As well as this, we want to kind of think about how paleontology connects with big issues and is really like an integral part of wider culture, wider society. So thinking about how paleontology has been connected with the media, both in terms of the media, being an important avenue for paleontologists to get news of their findings, news of their ideas out there, but also the media being quite important for shaping what kind of paleontological research gets done and how it gets presented. So with institutions like, say, National Geographic today, or what you can see here, the Illustrated London News, which is a very important British periodical from the first half of the 20th century. So these actually often drive quite a lot of paleontological research and paleontological discussion in public. Also thinking about technology, and particularly like media technologies. And so one example that comes across in quite a lot of the case studies in the book is in terms of, film technology and so on. So there's one kind of really kind of interesting sort of set of developments. So basically, whenever a new development in film kind of is initially tested out or initially becomes used in a big way, whether we're talking about animation in the first part of the 20th century, whether we're talking about stop motion from the 20s and 30s onwards, or CGI from the 80s and 90s, then one of the first things it's used for is reconstructing dinosaurs. And where we talk about Gertie or sort of Ray Harryhausen and so on, or Jurassic Park and so on. So why is that? Why is that kind of so prominent? Also going back to the more kind of ideological side of things, then we're quite interested in how paleontology connects with colonialism and empire. So fossils being taken from various different parts of the world in the 19th, 20th century and carrying up till today, and taken from often, poor parts of the world and taken to richer parts of the world, whether that's through like formal, colonial expeditions of, British or French or German paleontologists going to areas in Africa or Asia that they control and excavating fossils, or whether it's through like a more kind of informal economic way, as it's kind of more frequently done today, and thinking about how that's conditioned the field and an important part of both the dynamics of the field, but also some of the tropes that it pursues. And also thinking about money. So where does the funding for paleontology come from, and how does that condition the field and the discipline? So so really trying to think about paleontology not as being something separate from culture and society, but really kind of deeply embedded within all of these different processes. So within all of this, then Palaeoart is absolutely crucial. So Palaeoart's been one of the has been really, really important for, the scientific practice of paleontology in important ways. So being one of the key ways in which paleontologists are able to reconstruct and understand extinct animals and the worlds in which they lived from often very, very fragmented or scrappy fossil material. This has very often required the collaboration of artists, or bringing in a kind of artistic sensibility in order to do this. But then, of course, paleoartistic reconstructions have also been really important for generating profile for the field, for spreading the particular messages that paleontologists have wanted to, and for generating appeal, generating funds, and generating public interest. So the Palaeoart has been absolutely crucial in, I think, the majority of the chapters, of the volume. There's been some kind of paleoartistic dimension. And in terms of kind of thinking about Palaeoart, then one of the little sort of studies that I always go back to is this article that you can probably see on the left by Mark Whitten, Darren Nation, and John Conway, called State of the Palaeoart, which is quite old now. It was written about over 10 years ago, but this makes a really, really important, really, really interesting set of points. That Palaeoart is a field with its own history, and it's a really important field that has linked together science, historical developments, and artistic sensibility, and that we really do need to kind of appreciate it in this context. And so we've attempted to sort of follow that agenda within the book itself. So when Kareem asked me to put together the exhibition based on the book, which, so thanks very much, it was a really kind of fun thing to do, then what I didn't want to do was just recapitulate the book and just have sort of sections which were kind of corresponding to the different sections. But I wanted to kind of use some of the images from the book in a more, to ask a few different questions and to sort of jump off what the book is doing and to kind of put things in a new way. And what I was kind of quite interested in doing was connecting with these three different questions of, firstly, how has the role of Palaeoart in public discussion, public presentation of paleontology changed over time? That was one kind of big question. Second question was moving on to a more kind of taxonomic focus. So how and why have different taxa and different sort of animal groups been represented in public Palaeoart, and how has that varied depending on the different groups? And also, as a third kind of question, like what forms of art connected with paleontology, which can include Palaeoart, but not necessarily be entirely limited to that. How has that been important for paleontology's public role, and why? And so that's been the kind of guiding questions which I sort of followed when I was kind of putting the online exhibition together. So yeah, so this is kind of addressing the sort of 19th century and the kind of question of how has Palaeoart changed and its kind of public role changed over time. So, obviously the field of paleontology and geology get established as what you might call, institutionalized scientific fields in the late 18th and early 19th century, although of course there is a much deeper set of engagements with, what we might call fossils nowadays earlier than that. But the kind of, you can really trace current paleontological kind of practices to the late 18th and early 19th century, and Palaeoart becomes important within this almost from the beginning. This is kind of one of the images from the book that I really like, which is the 1831 frontispiece to a German, very, very dense kind of series of volumes put together by Georg Goldfuss, called Petrofacta Germaniae, so literally sort of, Germanic petrifaction, so Germanic fossils or sort of rocky things that you find in the ground. And what this is doing is it's reconstructing the Jura formation, so Jurassic South Germany, and the various things which are living there. And so you've got, a whole load of invertebrates down there in this entire sort of, massive sequence. You've got some marine reptiles in the middle. That thing at the back, if I can sort of show this thing, I think is supposed to be a megalosaurus. So because this is very, very early, so it's when people are still reinterpreting Megalosaurus as being like a giant monitor lizard type thing and scaling it up accordingly. And then you've got various crocodilians, and you've also got some little Mesozoic mammals down here. And Elsa Petrolian, I think that these are probably the first ever Mesozoic mammals to be put into like a paleoartistic scene, and so this is quite interesting. And so this is kind of showing that very, very early within the history of the field, people are reconstructing, these very interesting, very sort of dynamic environments where they're attempting to both show the tremendous diversity of life in the past. They're also attempting to kind of localize it in both place. So this is Jurassic South Germany, but also time. So this is one particular stratum within the deep past. And also kind of showing, the great sort of variety of animals which can be reconstructed from the fossil world. But of course, this isn't the first one of these, because what would be the kind of what would be the more obvious? Henry Delabèche's Doria Antiquior, which is from about a year before this German example, which is probably the first attempt to construct a really sort of fully developed scene of prehistoric life. And again, is sort of doing a very, very similar thing to the Goldfuss piece, where this isn't, Jurassic South Germany. This is Jurassic Dorset, so in the south, in the south of England, so the region around. The sort of region which Lyme Regis is a part of, which Lewis Carey and I were talking about before. And this is, the poor plesiosaur, lol, indeed. So this sketch is, kind of drawn by Henry Delabèche, who is a early 19th century British geologist and artist. It's actually initially sort of drawn and sold to raise money for Mary Anning, so the very, very important, Southern English fossil collector, to mean that she could actually get some funds to collect all of the ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs that she's excavating and then selling on to important sort of eminent naturalists and so on. And then most of these fossils, or most of these animals, are kind of dramatizing the creatures that Mary Anning was kind of excavating and selling, which means that this image of the Doria Antiquior is actually circulated and sold very, very widely, so people can buy prints of this and put them up on their walls or include them in their lectures if they're scientists and so on. And so this kind of German example from the last slide is actually an attempt to make a German version of the Dora Antiquial. So William Buckland, who's a very important early 19th century geologist, writes to Henry de la Beche and say, the Germans have made a parody of your Dora Antiquial, so ripping off. They're also saying that this means that this is a really, really interesting popular genre, and Henry de la Beche should make more of these, which he doesn't really do. He does lots of cartoons and lots of sort of similar things, but he doesn't really do quite sort of many scenes of this. But I think kind of contrasting the two images is quite interesting, because as Amanda kind of drew out, the Dora Antiquial is a very kind of violent image. All the animals are, eating each other, they're fighting, they're all kind of toothy and aggressive, and it is, or nearly 30 years before, Darwin puts together, kind of promotes this idea of nature being driven by conflict and and struggle and so on. These ideas are already out there, really, within sort of British popular science, at least. And another kind of important thing around the context behind this is Henry de la Beche is, on the one hand, he's a geologist, but he also owns plantations in Jamaica, so plantations which are being worked by enslaved people, and spends quite a lot of time in Jamaica earlier in his life. And so there have been arguments that when he's reconstructing this scene of tropical ancient Dorset, then he actually has, Jamaica in mind as a sort of model, and so he's bringing in his perception of, the colonial British world into views of deep time. And this is, one of these other things. And another sort of aspect around this is, the region this is depicting in the south of England, Dorset. Like nowadays, it's a place where people go for beach holidays, and it's quite sort of the kind of beach holidays you can have in England. Well, anyway, and so it's sort of known for that, for kind of quite genteel coastal resorts. But at this time, in the 1830s, it's actually a really, really poor, really impoverished area. And at the time that this is being sort of drawn, then you have what's called the swing riots, which are basically massive kind of uprisings by agricultural people against landlords, against property owners and so on, burning down fields and so on. And this is sort of going on at the same time that Henry de la Beche is painting this. So there is this kind of more violent, social context which is going on. So that's also, one of the things which is maybe feeding into these ideas of what ancient Dorset is like. But we then have this kind of German example, which is sort of a lot more peaceful. Like, you can't see it, you might not be able to see it, but this plesiosaur is trying to eat. What's it trying to eat? Some kind of cephalopod type thing. But generally, the animals are, a lot more subdued and are just sort of posing than they are in the Dora Antiquial image. So there's a slightly different view of the natural world which is being put through in this German version, which might be due to different understandings of nature in Germany at the time, might be due to Goldfuss having to fit so many things into this. There are various different interpretations that you could have. Moving into some of the other kind of 19th century examples from the book, then here we've got some from both popular science works and from Jules Verne's Voyage to the Centre of the Jules Verne's Voyage to the Centre of the Earth, which is drawing from paleontological works from the 19th century. And you can see that there is this sort of trend within a lot of 19th century paleoart to follow the line being presented by de la Beche of it being of prehistory being defined by violence and conflict and struggle and so on, whether it's the plesiosaur and the ichthyosaur eating each other, or on the right you have this quite interesting image, which is again I think trying to show a Jurassic scene from a British, very early 20th century British popular science work, where you've got these pterosaurs and this crocodilian attacking what to us look like platypuses. It's platypus. I think platypuses isn't acceptable plural. It's eating what to us look like platypuses, but to the author and the artist of this, these aren't platypuses. These are early mammals. With the sort of idea that that monotremes represent earlier stages of evolution, and so in the Jurassic you only had platypuses or kind of monotremes as the representatives of mammals, and that later mammals became higher and more developed types like first marsupials and then placentals, which is feeding into a very directional view of evolution, but is also feeding into these ideas that the parts of the world where you still have monotremes and marsupials are reflective of earlier stages of evolution, more primitive stages, and so places like Australia are therefore undeveloped and inferior to other parts, to the sort of northern hemisphere. And so again, paleontology is used for these kind of colonial arguments, which now people are very kind of rightly, very strongly sort of arguing against. So that's kind of 19th century Palaeoart, and that this is kind of present in some of this sort of stuff, but then it's not, the only sort of mode. Like this is, we don't have time to read it, but this is, it's in the exhibition. But while in the 19th century you do have these very kind of hierarchical and conflict-ridden ideas of deep time and paleontology and so on, even at the time, many people are arguing against this as being either sort of silly or misguided or reflecting, human arrogance, basically. So this is a really, really cool poem by a poet called May Kendall, called The Lay of the Trilobite. And basically the story of the poem is you've got this eminent Victorian naturalist who goes up to a mountain, finds a trilobite fossilized. This is the trilobite being depicted in the image, and as you will probably not call that a trilobite if you're going to bring modern things.
Not quite, no.
No, it's a fairly good caricatured Eurypterid, but not a trilobite. So I'm not quite sure what's going on there. But part of the conceit of the poem as well is that modern science is too arrogant and is making all sorts of misguided characterizations. But the naturalist meets this trilobite, and then the trilobite sings a song to him, which basically says, your modern society is, it's overstimulating you, it's making you too anxious, you've got war, conflict, colonialism, and so on. You are not a happy society, whereas as a trilobite, then, what is it? Gentle, stupid, free from woe, I dwelt among my nation, I didn't care, I didn't know that I was a crustacean, and so on. So, so the crustacean is saying that basically back in his time, or her time, it's not gender at all, then it had a much nicer life, and then at the end, the kind of scientist basically agrees. So even in the 19th century, at the high point of, colonialism and, human-centered scientific arrogance, in some respects, people are arguing against this. So we do have back in history these more kind of complicated sort of areas. Okay, so that's the 19th century. We can now go into the 20th century. So to kind of start with, then obviously Palaeoart is really, really significant throughout paleontology in the 20th century, both on the scientific level that we were kind of talking about earlier, of allowing paleontologists and paleontological research institutes to promote their finds, but also to kind of imagine distinct worlds and lost organisms, and also becomes really, really important for the public promotion of the field. So Palaeoart in museums has a very important kind of link with Palaeoart and reconstructions of fossil animals within popular culture. So you've got on the right a nice series of drawings by Mark Whitten, which are showing how different views of Spinosaurus change, including both reconstructions within scientific journals, but also reconstructions of Spinosaurus within comics and more kind of popular media. So looking at these as both part of the same process and really, really feeding off one another in really interesting ways. One of the kind of issues, though, if you want to kind of do a book like we were doing, or just a general book of historical Palaeoart, and one of the reasons why we have this set of drawings by Mark in the book, is that if you want to kind of reproduce or study 19th century Palaeoart or Palaeoart up into the 1920s, then it's quite easy because, a huge amount of stuff is digitized, and it's also now public domain. It's free of copyright restrictions. So it's very kind of easy to use, really easy to engage with. If you want to use and look at more contemporary Palaeoart, so from the last 10, 20, 30 years, that's also quite easy because you can, write to modern Palaeoartists, and because the Palaeoart community is quite nice, friendly, and quite well integrated, they will often let you, reproduce material if you acknowledge it properly and so on. But if you want to kind of engage with Palaeoart from the 1920s up until about the 1990s, then you have a problem in that stuff is subjected to copyright in a major way, and it can be very difficult to trace rights holders, and just difficult to work out exactly, how you can reproduce stuff. And so this means that for kind of historical research, historical books, then it means that you have to be very, very careful that you don't just focus on the 19th century or the very, very contemporary period, because that's easier, and then have to find ways around looking at this more contemporary period, which, becomes a big kind of problem for writing the history of Palaeoart, where the kind of mid-20th century is where quite a lot of interesting stuff is happening. Having said that, though, Palaeoart in much of the 20th century, I think it's not unfair to say, is quite conservative as an artistic genre. So these are kind of sort of representative examples of Palaeoart from the very late 1920s and early 1930s. So some of the murals that Charles R. Knight did for the Field Museum in Chicago, and they're very naturalistic representations of animals in landscapes. They're very kind of interesting as art. But in terms of the artistic style, this is kind of the same kind of art you could have produced, 30 or 40 years prior to this. So Palaeoart as a genre is still, quite conservative and isn't kind of as experimental as much 20th century art is. So they're not kind of bringing in abstraction or sort of expressionistic designs very much, which I think is interesting if we try to put Palaeoart within, the history of art. Even though, as Amanda kind of drew in, then there can be, you can sometimes trace some influences from things like Impressionism within some of it, but that's often quite subdued, and it's not very kind of dramatic. Having said that, though, one thing that I am quite interested in is how paleontological topics or paleoartistic sort of attempts do sometimes get worked into more experimental 20th century art. And I'm trying to, work out how extensive this is, because it's something that people haven't really looked at. It's kind of more paleontologically inspired, more experimental art in the 20th and 21st centuries. And one examples of these that we have in the book is this Glyptodon model, so model of one of these kind of big armadillo-like things that lived in South America and parts of North America in the Cenozoic and up until the Pleistocene. And this is from the Argentina chapter, which is one I really like. It talks about glyptodons as having a really, really important cultural role in Argentina. And so this is quite an experimental set of reconstructions of glyptodons as both a sketch and as a sculpture by an Argentinian architect and artist called Clorindo Testa. And, it's quite interesting to actually see a reconstruction of a glyptodon in an art gallery. It's also quite interesting in terms of what the glyptodon is supposed to represent, because this glyptodon on the right, the sculpture, is in the kind of narrative of the artwork. It's not a glyptodon from the past, it's a glyptodon from the future. And so it's one that's been excavated in a future after all humans have died out, and it's been excavated from Patagonia, from a period in which humans were rebuilding glyptodons and worshipping them in particular ways. So there's this kind of quite interesting thing going on there. But the other thing, and the author of the Argentina chapter, Arina Podgorny, she gave a talk to our group, but she did actually say that the way in which this kind of contemporary artistic glyptodon is being reconstructed, where you built this frame and the kind of shell is being reconstructed from these individual little bits, is actually very, very similar to how you would actually reconstruct a glyptodon specimen in a museum, because generally they're found completely collapsed with scoops basically everywhere, and you actually have to remake the dome of the shell and put them back together in a very, very painstaking process. So, which kind of makes a kind of quite interesting point that, the glyptodon models that we find in museums and other fossil kind of reconstructions we find in museums are themselves almost like sculptures, almost like artworks in the way in which they're being kind of reconstructed. And then finally, in our sort of Palaeoart moving into the kind of 21st century, then, obviously over the last few decades, we've had a huge explosion of Palaeoart, which is really, really interesting, I think. not just because I'm interested in paleontology and public culture, but really interesting as like an art form, as a particular community, and so on, where you've got many people producing Palaeoart in a community which is crossing national borders, which is linking together on kind of almost equal terms, like people who are doing it as a hobby versus people who are professional paleoartists, and then a whole range of different people in between. So it becomes actually quite difficult to categorize people. Also drawing off the whole movement following from All Yesterdays of, trying to sort of reconstruct fossil animals in a very creative way, which is working out how far can we actually speculate on what these might have been like as kind of living, breathing animals. And also both drawing on, playing with, and subverting a lot of the historical tropes in the kind of paleontological reconstruction. So here we've got two illustrations from our Mesozoic mammal chapter by Danny Navarro, who thankfully let us use these in our book. One which is showing a very kind of, modern dinosaur, a modern sort of theropod with kind of feathers and kind of full articulation and so on, following the kind of standard trope of eating a Mesozoic mammal, with Mesozoic mammals being dinosaur food, which is, as we saw back with the Carl Wimper image, something that goes way back to the 19th century. But then drawing on new fossils and new tropes, we've also got this other sort of way of thinking about the relationship between different Mesozoic taxa, which is, this big badger-sized Mesozoic mammal, Repenomamus, found from, I think the fossils are from Liaoning in China, attacking this nest of psittacosaurs and eating the babies, which is maybe one interpretation of one of the fossil specimens. So, playing with different tropes. And also, current paleoart is interesting in other ways in terms of kind of media, because quite often paleoartists are working within digital media, digital art. So this being a kind of really interesting sort of set of developments, which is partly, drawing off the community and the practices of paleoartists, with this being quite a, community which has been very much galvanized by social media and by online modes of communication, which is, why we're having this kind of event, but also is part of the practice of it, because it means that, if you've got digital art, then you can, quite quickly make changes, and you can quite quickly make adaptations, and maybe change the feathering on this on this theropod, or change the fur, or on the mammal, or change the vegetation and so on, as new fossils are found and as the kind of imagery of this period kind of changes. Right, so that's the kind of historical period. Okay, so for the kind of exhibit, then I came up with 3 taxonomic groups that were particularly important across the different chapters. So the first one would be sauropods, and sauropods were in lots and lots of the chapters, and that's probably not massively surprising, because from the 1900s onwards, sauropod dinosaurs have been some of the key icons of paleontology. In the early 20th century, then in much public sort of discussion, that if you say dinosaur, then the immediate representation would be a sauropod, not any kind of theropod or ornithischian and so on. And so that's kind of one element of it. But then obviously, there are the issues around sauropods and their position in both scientific practice and paleoart and in the public imagination, which is, these are things which are so different to anything which is living today, in terms of, morphology, in terms of size, in terms of how you might understand the physiology of these animals, their place in kind of ecosystems and so on, that, they require a huge amount of imagination and kind of creativity and engagement with, public culture in order to just kind of understand and reconstruct. So that's kind of one major element around this. Another sort of major element around, the public presentation and engagement with sauropods is there's been, from the 1900s, a huge amount of marketing of them, and particularly marketing of them coming from US organizations, which over in the kind of first half of the 20th century grow on such a scale that, they massively overshadow paleontological institutions in other parts of the world in terms of funding and in terms of media entanglement. So on the one hand, we have things like the Carnegie Diplodocus, which is excavated in the American West, mounted in the Pittsburgh Museum, and then copies of it are sent to all across Europe and also to South America, and that becomes really, really important for presenting sauropods as these key icons of through history. Amanda's got the Sinclair kind of oil oil. So you've got one, excellent, good. We actually at the Popularizing Paleontology group had a paper by Mike Benton and Vicky Cools, which was specifically talking about the sauropod, the Sinclair dinosaurs and their various kind of uses. So you've got Sinclair marketing them to sell gasoline, and then you've also got this specimen here, which is the AMNH Brontosaurus, which is mounted in 1905 as what is, I think, is now kind of recognised as the first time that a fully mounted, also reconstructed skeleton of a sauropod is put in place. And the kind of AMNH sauropod is the iconic dinosaur for much of the early 20th century and forms the basis of a lot of pop culture reconstructions. I think the Sinclair dinosaur model is based on the AMNH model, but also things like Gertie the dinosaur and so on. This animation from the 1910s is based on this mount, and you can see from the kind of image. Is it possible? Can I zoom in? Let me see if this is going to work. No, it's not going to work. But if you kind of look around the kind of AMNH display, then it's kind of quite interesting and being very, very multimedia. So, the dinosaur itself, the dinosaur mount, is, I think, fossils from 3 or 4, maybe even more, or kind of individuals, plus a lot of kind of reconstructed plaster, and it's mounted on this kind of very complicated kind of steel armature. But then you've got like a little sauropod model down there of the skeleton. You've got the kind of quite famous artwork by Charles R. Knight of the kind of amphibious Brontosaurus there. And you probably can't see it, but in the background you've also got a Charles R. Knight sculpture. So visitors to this museum display could, on the one hand, be confronted with the reconstructed fossil to give a sense of the animal, its skeleton and its size, but then could also follow the artwork to kind of imagine what it would have been like in life in various different ways. So that's the AMNH sauropod. But then, all through the 19th and century up until the present, then there's been a huge amount of experimentation around reconstructing and understanding sauropods, whether we're talking about, the animation Gertie, which you can see being played in the exhibit, whether it's through these sorts of imaginative reconstructions of dinosaurs which are being excavated in East Africa by British expeditions in the 1920s, or whether it's within this sort of more speculative sort of artwork, which is kind of growing off kind of more recent trends in Palaeoart. So John Conway's Giraffe and Branca and the Mudbars, where we've had these kind of quite evocative social sauropods with their kind of head crests and so on. So a huge amount of kind of interest and kind of speculation going into sauropods and their reconstruction. Another kind of important thing is that, drawing off this image actually, is that one thing which gets hidden in the history of sauropod research is that it is very kind of closely connected to the colonial histories that we were kind of talking about earlier. So on the one hand, specimens like the AMNH sauropod, the AMNH Brontosaurus, are being taken from lands in what is then the United States West, which had very, very, very recently been taken from indigenous people. So they're being kind of excavated in that sense. You have also some of the biggest excavations, kind of excavating sauropod remains outside of North America, are being conducted in East Africa in the early parts of the 20th century. So first mainly in a region called Tendaguru in what's now Tanzania, that we kind of mentioned earlier, which is firstly a British colony, but is firstly a German colony that is then transferred to Britain after the First World War. But here are kind of some kind of quite interesting images from the Tendaguru excavations, which relied on, I think in some instances, it was 300 African workers who were involved in excavating this material. And you've got sort of lots of, photographs of the excavations, which are very much, showing it as a colonial project of mass, labor organization. But these images are quite interesting to actually show how some of the African workers were actually engaging with the fossils. And so there you've got a sketch by an unnamed African worker showing the fossils sort of in situ, and there you've got the imagining of what the animal in life might have been like, which is quite interesting because it's sort of obviously drawing off contemporary African wildlife, so probably monocled lizards and so on, and also maybe drawing off Palaeoart as well, because the German colonists will actually show the workers pictures, Palaeoart, kind of Charles R. Knight reconstructions and so on, to show them what they were digging, and so this also feeds into the kind of process. And yet, though, as Amanda says, yeah, Argentina as well. So obviously now, one of the big centerpieces that all the museums with space want is a Patagonian titanosaur, which, obviously being taken from the far south of Argentina in a region which in the latter part of the 19th century is conquered in a really, 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 really brutal series of, colonial wars that the Argentinian state waged against the indigenous people, which, yeah, absolutely decimates them and takes over their land. The kind of interesting thing about the paleontology in Patagonia, which is drawing off this, is that, and this connects back to the kind of earlier books that I wrote, The Age of Mammals, is that for the kind of first, probably almost century of paleontology in Patagonia, then paleontologists going there are usually not very interested in the dinosaur bones. They comment on them, they comment on walking over dinosaur eggshells in many regions, but they don't really write about them very much in terms of scientific study. They're much, much more interested in the mammals and in the kind of human remains, because these are much more kind of culturally important within Argentinian paleontology. It's only kind of more recently, over the last kind of 20 or 30 years, that, dinosaurs have become, the almost a sort of monomanic thing that people focus on in terms of paleontology and its role in public culture, which means that the value which has been attached to Argentinian dinosaurs has massively increased from a position that it wasn't actually sort of accorded in the earlier history of the discipline. Okay, right, so that's sauropods. The other two can go through quite quickly. There's a very cool chapter by Ilya Newland, who actually wrote a really, really good book on the Carnegie Diplodocus and how that's sent around the world, called American Dinosaur Abroad, which is very worth reading if you haven't checked it out. But yeah, Ilya did a really, really interesting chapter looking at the relations between two different fossil taxa, one of which is now very, very prominent, so Dimetrodon, which is now almost an honorary, it pretty much is regarded and presented as being an honorary dinosaur, and one of the few, Permian animals which is in the kind of fossil canon which all sort of prehistoric enthusiasts know. And the other kind of creature is Nausaurus, which is chimerical. So it's basically a Dilophosaurus skeleton with a Dimetrodon head, but this is regarded as a kind of distinct taxa in the kind of 1900s, 1910s. Yes, there's a bit in this chapter about why Otto Jäckel, who is actually a really important paleontologist who's instrumental in promoting more biological views of paleontology in the early 20th century. There's a bit on that Ilya writes about why he decided that this was a plausible reconstruction. The chapter is quite interesting in terms of both how do scientists and paleoartists work together to reconstruct this animal, which is, has this feature which is just so distinctive and so unlike any kind of contemporary animal analogy, but also how the ways of doing this and the fossils and the reconstructions move quite some distance, because the main interest in this animal is in the United States, which is kind of expected because the fossils are found in kind of Texas and Oklahoma, but also is kind of discussed in Germany to a great deal, and so the kind of fossils and kind of reconstructions move in these interesting ways. And the kind of final taxonomic group, which is very, very prominent across many of the chapters, are homonyms, so like human ancestors. And, these are, there are so many and such distinctive, ways in which human ancestors get discussed in public culture and scientific culture, that this is often kind of treated in the history of science as a very distinctive field, history of paleoanthropology, because it deals with all the questions that history of paleontology deals with. So how do you reconstruct, how do you understand fossil organisms? But then it brings in a whole range of other questions about what does it mean to be human, where does humanity start, what are the distinctive features of humanity, and where did these develop, and how humans fit in with the natural world, and also how early humans engaged with many of the kind of creatures of prehistory. So histories of paleoanthropology often have this very kind of strong reflexive element, which is present in other forms of paleontology and public culture, but are really, really kind of thrown into relief in quite distinctive ways. And again, you can see some quite dramatic changes over time in this. So it's not universal, but there is a kind of tendency in much 19th and early 20th century Palaeoart and kind of public views of human ancestors to present them as these very kind of barbaric, savage, ape-like creatures, which are either quite unhuman or are sort of lacking in many of the characteristics that sort of 19th and early 20th century elite paleontologists would kind of classify humanity as having, so as being these sort of savage and brutish creatures, which obviously connects in quite strong ways with the ways in which colonized and indigenous people are often sort of represented in this period. So there's often quite a strong overlap between dehumanizing early human ancestors, dehumanizing Neanderthals, and dehumanizing people like Aboriginal Australians or Indigenous Patagonians and so on. That's a kind of major thing. But also sort of reflecting on, ideas around evolution and human connection with apes and so on. So that's a major kind of feature of the sort of early artwork. But in terms of more recent reconstructions, like this is one reconstruction from the Neanderthal Museum in Mettmann in Germany, then there's been a sort of major shift in how you would represent human ancestors, where now there's very much a tendency to reconstruct them as being very human and being different types of human to Homo sapiens, but having these very expressive faces, looking at the viewer in a very kind of direct way, and being sort of individuals that you can empathise with in a very sort of distinctive way. So within history of human evolutionary studies and paleontology, then there have been major sorts of shifts over the last few years, which have really sort of moved against a lot of the old, racial, colonial, and also sort of gender stereotypes, which a lot of old paleoanthropology was quite instrumental in sort of connecting with. Right, so that's the kind of taxa section. Any kind of thoughts or ideas or questions or things you'd like to discuss?
For me, not yet.
Okay, in that case, we can sort of move on to the final bit, which is a bit short, which is another sort of thing which I didn't actually think about before I actually went about putting together the images for the exhibition, is that we had a lot of chapters and a lot of kind of discussion of not necessarily kind of Palaeoart as scientific reconstruction or paleontological kind of themes being connected with science, popular media, but there was quite a lot that was actually talking about paleontological artwork within public space. So how you get this kind of monumental Palaeoart in many areas, and how this is actually really, really interesting thinking about both what gets depicted, where it gets depicted, and again, the various kind of cultural forces which are going into this. So here are just some examples from Britain and Germany of things which are kind of featuring in the book, where, obviously, the first and also one of the most iconic examples of a kind of very dramatic, very sort of large scale instance of paleoart in public space are the reconstructions of the dinosaurs, Mesozoic reptiles, and fossil mammals at the Crystal Palace Park in southeast London, which are put in place in the 1850s as the first attempt to really sort of reconstruct fossil animals in life. And while in kind of older media, they were often kind of presented as being funny because they were wrong or superseded and so on. There's been real kind of, important reevaluation of them recently as both actually really sophisticated attempts, given the kind of state of knowledge, and also really, really important in terms of, the various techniques that were going into them. And, very widely discussed at the time. We've also got things like, this, which is a whole series of murals of different prehistoric animals on the facade of the Berlin Aquarium. There's about maybe like about 10, 15, 20 of these on the aquarium, reconstructing different prehistoric animals, and they're primarily done by a German artist called Heinrich Harder. And this was initially a reconstruction of the Nausaurus, so this kind of chimeric taxon, which Ilya talks about, but it was renamed Edaphosaurus on the label when Nausaurus was sort of struck on the record. And kind of paleontological themes in public art, continue to this day, with a kind of quite dramatic example being the very, very recently constructed statue of Mary Anning in Lyme Regis, which was unveiled a few years ago and was kind of funded by a very, very large scale public campaign. And it's a really kind of interesting piece of art, as well as being an important way of honouring this person who was really, really connected with the region and really, really important to developing the field of paleontology. So it's quite interesting the way it's kind of set within the landscape, because she's on basically the outskirts of town, and she is the statue is literally her walking towards the cliff with her dog and her collecting bag going to excavate fossils. So it's a really kind of nicely done piece of art. So these are all quite interesting examples of this kind of European monumental paleo art. But one thing that sort of struck me from some of the examples is that, you have this kind of tradition of monumental paleo art in other parts of the world too. So this is a really, really interesting sculpture that I really do want to see one day, which is in Ehrenhut in Inner Mongolia, which is a really, really important place for excavating dinosaur fossils in China. And this is called, I don't know who the sculptor is. I haven't been able to kind of trace this, but these are kind of two really, really massive sauropod sculptures, and they're kind of kissing over the highway, and they're sort of set aside a whole lot of other dinosaur sort of sculptures. So as you enter Ehrenhut, then you kind of get this very, very direct image that you're kind of entering a very important dinosaurian place where the dinosaurs are active and present within the landscape. And another kind of interesting set of examples that a former student of mine is actually writing something on at the moment is, if we go back to the sort of Tendaguru region, which is now in the sort of country of Tanzania, then there are actually now quite recently designed these dinosaur sculptures in the sort of region. So you've got a reconstruction of the Giraffatitan, life size, so the same specimen which is in the centerpiece of the Berlin Museum by a local artist called Paul Maturi, and it is life size in the roundabout. You go around it and you have this massive sauropod in the middle. You've also got various others. So you've got this theropod, which I think Mark Whitten told me that there aren't actually any large-scale theropods which have been excavated from Tendaguru yet, but this is kind of imagining one that might have been excavated there. And this is in a different part of Africa. This is in Lesotho, so kind of state which is kind of enveloped by South Africa. but this is a kind of more local form of paleoart, which is illustrating what the kind of creature that might have made the footprints, which the site is sort of is sort of built around. Because in Lesotho there are quite a few sites where you've got I think I can't remember precisely what, I think they're Jurassic, but you've got quite a lot of Jurassic dinosaur footprints made by ornithopod dinosaurs. This is a kind of local imagining of what what the creatures that made the footprints might have been like. So yeah, so kind of following the kind of paleontology in public space also allows us to tell a broader story about paleoart and kind of trace it to places which are often kind of written out of most histories of paleontology. Um, okay, so that's kind of covered, I think, everything that's in the exhibition, and that's covered the kind of paleontology in public space. So yeah, so any